Morning.
I do it.
No.
Yes.
Morning, Sue.
Judy wanted her lipstick to show.
No, she wanted all of my face to show.
And today we're having salmon in mushroom sauce with mushrooms and assorted vegetables.
Oh,
Sounds nice, doesn't
can I come?
it? The salmon only comes in pairs. You'd have to bring your boyfriend with you.
Oh, those sort of pears. I thought you meant pears. I thought you meant. I thought
They
you
come in
meant,
twos.
Apples and pears, like going up the stairs.
you meant pears, as in yes, in eaty pears. You mean pears as in PAIRS? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I thought you meant.
So I'm trying to have a discreet conversation about my plans for entertaining my daughter to tea tonight. And the rest of the world's hearing it.
Well, that's all right.
Strange, yeah.
That's all right. It's nice to share.
It's all right. I'll put you on mute if you like, Martin.
Many have tried.
Yeah, 1 minute.
Little boy at church knows me because my daughter is his godmother. Had to do an essay at school. He's 7, so had to complete a story on a pro forma at school and about somebody they know that wasn't in the family. So he apparently wrote, he knows this man called Martin. And then there were a series of preset questions that he had to answer. What is notable about, what is unusual about Martin? The answer, he doesn't have an indoor voice. There you are.
Oh, that's rather sweetly put.
Well, he is 7, but his mum, who's a teacher, was looking at his work, and she said, "I saw that, and I thought that'll make Martin smile." It made me howl.
It's lovely.
Isn't it nice?
Lovely. Yes.
Very astute.
And very true, because my voice was trained when I was teaching dancing to Joyce Grenfell and et al. In a church hall without loudspeakers. Apart from that, we'll say good morning, Judy, and shall we make a start? I've got it recording. Let's do a view, speaker view. Does that look promising, Jonathan? Right. Judy, welcome, thank you, and off you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to see you again. And the reign of Edward III. There's quite a lot about Edward III, as you probably realise, because he was king for a long time. One of our very significant reigns, and a lot happened during his reign. Most of it good, not all of it good, obviously. The Black Death wasn't good. We're going to do that separately next time. So we'll just we'll do the good bits. The positive side of Edward III, or his reign. And it sounds awful saying the war against France was a positive, because I don't think any of us really approve of war. But it was one of the things that certainly went very well at the beginning of his reign. The war against France, the famous 100 Years' War, which wasn't constant warfare, as we said last time. There were summer campaigns, but not every summer, not by any means. It's a very on and off kind of affair. So it sounds rather startling saying the 100 Years' War. It was a war situation that existed for that length of time. There were many peace treaties, but they were broken. So the war against France. Now, this quarrel with France had been going on for a long time. And to be fair, both sides were responsible for the situation. There wasn't one country to blame. Historians used to say it was all France's fault, but nowadays we're much more rational and reasonable. It's historians trying to be fair.
But we still dislike the French.
And look at, yeah, we still dislike, well, some people dislike the French.
Sorry, David.
The three main reasons why this situation with France persisted. The fact that we still had part of our empire in France, the great empire that had existed in the reign of Henry II, largely due to his marriage alliance with Eleanor of Aquitaine. But the fact remained that the kings of England had to pay homage for their feudal land in France. Gascony, for example, a very rich area of France where the good wine was made. So Gascony was very important for all sorts of reasons, a very rich area in terms of rich agricultural land, but particularly vineyards. And Gascony made excellent wine, which was exported and made a lot of money. So it was difficult for kings of England to have to bow the knee before the King of France, or they sent a representative, a member of the royal family. They had to bow down and pay homage, and that irritated and humiliated the kings of England. Then there was an alliance, the Old Alliance it was called, in Scotland, the alliance between Scotland and France, which made us in England feel very uneasy because we were the filling in a hostile sandwich, surrounded by enemies. In other words, France and Scotland were in close alliance, and the Scots invaded us on a regular basis, not in a warlike situation, but they stole cattle on a regular basis. And the border between between England and Scotland was a very, very dangerous area because of the Scottish incursions, they'd be called today. Not exactly on a war footing, but we certainly weren't at peace with Scotland. So Scotland and France had this alliance, which made us feel in England somewhat paranoid. And then there were arguments about trade. Both sides responsible for this situation. Trade was developing very rapidly during this period, huge amounts of money being made, and the busy sea lanes were being interfered with by the French and the Genoese. I mean, that was what later became part of Italy. And the French were building a fleet at Rouen. We knew that they were building a fleet, a royal fleet. In other words, ships that we'd call them today battleships, with the idea of destroying the English merchant fleet. We had spies working in the shipyards where they were building this fleet, and we knew, our government knew, that the French were sort of up to no good. They were planning to destroy our merchant shipping. Plus, they were going to establish a naval blockade and prevent ships from reaching our ports. So totally interfering with our trade. So there was a kind of provocative situation developing between the two nations. And in 1337, the French became very proactive, and they actually confiscated Gascony and said it was now belonged to the French crown. It's no longer English territory. And we retaliated. We retaliated very dramatically. Our king, Edward III, who was half French, his mother was a French princess, Isabella, claimed the throne of France. So it's been like a game of chess. Each king, each government making a move, and our king made a very dramatic move, claiming to be the King of France. the rightful King of France, and he had a better claim than the existing King of France, King Philip. Edward III saying, I am actually the rightful King of France. And to prove it, he did a very provocative thing. He incorporated the French emblem, the fleur-de-lis, that was on the French flag, the French banner, put it onto his royal coat of arms, as if to say, there, I proved it. I am the rightful king of France as well as the rightful King of England. What are you going to do about it? It's like throwing down a gauntlet and saying, this is war. This is war. Let's sort it out on the field of battle. Edward III had other reasons for what he'd done, apart from irritation at the fact that the French had been pushing their luck for a long time. They'd been doing all kinds of provocative things. It was time for a showdown. But also, Edward had inherited a very difficult situation, a throne that was, not a crown, that was damaged by his father not having been a particularly impressive king. And the defeat at Bannockburn was kind of hanging over the country, this disgrace, the fact that the Scottish army, a smaller army, had defeated the English army, was a burning humiliation. And King Edward was determined to sort of cancel out that awful memory and that sort of blot on our prestige, the fact that we had been so heavily defeated by what was regarded as an inferior people and an inferior army. How could this have happened? We had got to redeem, the British army, the English army got to redeem itself. What better way than to take on the French? So, and Edward was full of all sorts of romantic ideas based on King Arthur, that he had to do something splendid to establish himself as the king, remembering that he'd come to the throne as a teenager, so he probably felt he had a lot to prove, and to cancel out the inglorious reign of his father. He also, in a very practical way, he was very good with money. He also knew that if the campaign against France was successful, if we could take them on in battle and win, we could take a lot of very prestigious French prisoners. And in those days, you didn't necessarily kill your enemy, you took them prisoner. At least the posh ones, the rich ones, you didn't kill them, you took them prisoner. You then locked them up in a castle somewhere, and you put them through a really difficult time. Like, they had to wear manacles hand and foot, and manacles in those days were really, really heavy. It meant you could hardly move. So you had leg irons, they were called, and also very, very heavy handcuffs, and you were fastened to the wall. They made it very hard to go to the loo, and I don't know how they went to the loo, I don't want to go into that, but it made it hard to eat, even to hold a bowl. If they brought you a bowl of food, how are you going to manage the bowl and a spoon if they didn't offer you a table or something to rest on? So initially, the captivity was very harsh, and just a very simple sort of mattress on the floor sort of situation. You were then held for ransom. And as each instalment of the very high ransom was paid, so your condition, you the prisoner, your conditions were improved. Like, they took the leg irons off, then they took the hand manacles, the manacles are called, they were removed. You were still chained to the wall by your waist. You had so you couldn't escape. Then, if the next instalment was paid, they'd take the waist chains off, and they give you a nicer bed, perhaps even give you a proper bed. Then your food would improve. Then you would be moved from a little cell to a bigger cell. And then maybe when the ransom had nearly all been paid, you would be moved to a proper room and you'd be allowed to have servants, as you would have had in your civilian life. And then when almost all the ransom had been paid, you were treated with civility, as you should be, as a nobleman or a very important person. And then when the last instalment was paid, you were free to go. So it depended how often they were paying the ransom, how many installments they were going to pay. That would all be negotiated. Very occasionally, it would be paid in a lump sum, as it had been for Richard I when he was captured by the Duke of Austria and put in Dornstein Castle. It was like crowdfunding. His mother, Ellen of Aquitaine, sort of miraculously managed to get the money sorted, so it was all paid in a lump sum and her son was released. But usually it was done in installments. So ransoms, very important money earner. And the other side did it as well. So the death rate really wasn't as fantastically high, certainly was nothing like as high as it became in later wars. The idea of capturing people and holding them to ransom was a brilliant way of paying for the war, really, and making a huge profit. But the other thing that you could do if you invaded somebody else's country, of course, was the opportunity to loot. That was accepted as a perk of war. You were allowed to loot people's houses. You were allowed you weren't supposed to, but you could loot cathedrals where they had rich things on the altar, like candlesticks. You were, on certain occasions, you were allowed a dispensation. The troops were allowed to loot, and it was permitted. On other occasions, of course, it wasn't. There were rules about this. So another opportunity to make lots of lovely money, and not only pay for the war itself, but make extra money for the next time, to get money in the treasury. So this was a very attractive idea. So lots of reasons why Edward III would want to go to war with the French. And the feeling that the French were mocking us. They were being deliberately provocative. It needed to be sorted out. So another thing that Edward III turned out to be very good at, although still a young king, was planning. Something his father had been pretty hopeless at doing. Planning. Not going to war until he felt he was going to win. So first of all, creating alliances. An alliance with Flanders and the Holy Roman Empire. There was no such country as Germany until 1871. It was a series of small states, but there was a sense of unity. They belonged to what was called the Holy Roman Empire, which had been created by Charlemagne. And as Palmerston once said, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Very sort of dismissive about the Holy Roman Empire, which was in decline by the 19th century, which is when Palmerston made this scathing comment about the Holy Roman Empire, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. What we would now call the part of Europe that speaks German. So it included Austria, of course. So we created an alliance with Flanders and the Holy Roman Empire. Queen Philippa herself was Flemish, and the Flemings didn't like the French. So we had got friends on the continent, powerful, important friends. Flanders wasn't all that big, but it was very rich in terms of trading opportunities. And King Edward showed tremendous skill in raising money at home. So he created a war fund, not like some kings who just sort of impulsively declared war on their enemies and then thought, hello, we're running out of money already. You know, how can we maintain our troops in the field? Oh no, Edward III planned this meticulously, made sure that he had a huge war fund. raising funds, making vast amounts of money, and because our wool exports were so buoyant, we're selling wool all over the known world by this time, because our wool was so good, it was practically waterproof. It was excellent, excellent quality wool. And because he was able then to tax woolen exports, he made a great deal of money without causing resentment. That had always been the problem in the past. If kings had raised the taxes, it created rage and discontent, particularly among the rich. The peasants didn't have any option. You know, they just had to pay. But the rich people got very annoyed about taxes going up. Edward III managed to tax exports and imports, like today, and raise a great deal of money without causing problems with his noblemen. So that was clever. And he also did a great deal to improve the collecting of taxes at home. Punishment for tax cheats, great efficiency in collecting the money, tremendous efficiency. Lists which are very valuable today, many of them have survived, names of every village, how many people were taxpayers and how much they had to pay, and check that they had paid. So it wasn't done actually by individuals. They paid into a fund in the village, and then when the tax collector came, he just got a bag of, literally a bag of money from the village. He didn't have to go from house to house asking for the separate contributions. They'd already paid into for the village. So this was very, very efficient as it could be in those days. And the other very clever thing he did, that the king did, was to persuade the MPs, because we had Parliament now, they could be tricky. They could complain and say, no, we don't think we should have to pay extra taxes. We're not in a position, the people are not in a position to pay. He flattered them, he persuaded them, he said, you know, our country is under attack. We need to teach these French people a lesson. He made it sound so exciting that Parliament submitted and said, oh yes, what a brilliant idea. Yeah, we do need to have a war with the French. Yeah, we'll accept increases in taxation. We're totally behind you. We agree with it. Wow, that was the first. Before that, MPs had been really quite awkward and argumentative and questioned whether it was necessary to spend money. That was their job, to keep an eye on expenditure. You know, what do you want the money for? Are you spending it on palaces? Are you building more castles? Is your queen consort spending it on clothes? That had been the picture in the past. What do you want the money for? And the king openly said, I want the money to go to war with France. And these are the reasons why it would be a brilliant idea. And Parliament agreed. Wow. He got the guarantee. Now he can go to war without an embarrassing lack of funds, suddenly having to withdraw and say, no, well, we've run out of money. But it started off with a great naval victory at, I'm not sure how to say this, Sluis or Sluis, offshore Flanders. A tremendous naval victory ended the threat of invasion, because there was fear that the French were going to invade and take us over and make us into a French province. So this ended the threat of invasion and also sorted out the French so that they were no longer interfering with our sea lanes, with our means of communication with the continent and our trade route. That sorted them out, certainly at sea. And then the land invasion. We've already talked about the Great Battle of Crécy, 1346, a triumphant, amazing victory, which really justified what the king had been saying. We want to teach the French a lesson. Well, they'd well and truly been taught a lesson. Their cavalry had been more of a problem, more of an obstacle than an asset. Cavalry are all very well if you've got a clear line of a kind of open field where your horses can gallop to their heart's content. In a restricted area, cavalry are not very useful. In fact, they are a problem. And if you can, it sounds awful now, well, it's awful then. If you can injure the horses, or even kill the horses, so obviously the rider has to fall off. And riders, cavalrymen who are used to being on a horse are not all that brilliant when they haven't got the horse anymore. Fighting in full armour, not so brilliant. Also probably injured as they fall off the horse in full armour. The horse then collapses and then becomes a hazard, an obstacle. So the French relied very heavily on their cavalry chargers. And it turned out not to be a very brilliant idea. In fact, we didn't use cavalry at all at the Battle of Poitiers. We didn't use cavalry. Men rode to the battle on a horse and then dismounted, fought on foot. It's interesting. So in Crécy, victory for the longbow, and many, many valuable prisoners taken alive for ransom, just as the king had promised. This, if it worked, was going to be a profitable enterprise. It wasn't just going to be a military victory, it was going to be money in our pockets. And that's what happened. Many of the prisons taken, there were quite a number taken to Warwick Castle. I don't know how many of you have been to Warwick Castle, probably a lot of you. In the dungeons, they actually show you where the French prisoners were manacled to the wall, and there are sort of deep lines down the wall, holes, long sections where the men with the manacles were sort of reaching up to get their food and then putting that, and it scraped the wall. It shows that they were in captivity for years, not just months. Very sad actually to see that. We used to take a year group from Arthur Terry to Warwick Castle and explain, and the pupils got very upset about this, the idea that somebody had got manacles on for that long, that it had actually carved deep grooves in the wall where they were manacled. It made them, it actually made them feel emotional, and they were sort of empathizing and thinking, well, how awful to be in prison for that long. Well, that was because their ransom wasn't being paid on a regular basis. As soon as an installment of the ransom turned up, they would probably be released from their fetters, another name for manacles. They would be released from the fetters. So Crécy, an absolutely fantastic victory, which didn't obliterate the shame of Bannockburn, but certainly made Englishmen, our ancestors, walk tall, feel proud. And that's what the king wanted. He wanted his people to feel proud of being English. This is a sort of comparatively new development. We weren't Anglo-French anymore. We weren't French. We were English, and proud of it. So another interesting thing about Crécy is that cannon were used for the first time, guns. I had to look this up because I thought it was a bit later. Guns were very unreliable. They were small, that wasn't why they were unreliable. In very early days for guns, we hadn't invented gunpowder. The Chinese had actually invented gunpowder, and we weren't quite sure how much of it to use. It was all very hit and miss and dangerous. And the early guns, they didn't know how to make them totally without a seam. That actually happened in the late 18th century. How to bore a gun, to bore a hole in a gun, so it didn't have a seam anywhere. The early guns were made in two parts and sort of welded together. So the seams where the two parts were joined were weak, obviously. So when you put shot in, so when you put gunpowder into the gun had a horrible tendency to sort of come apart. And it was actually very, very dangerous to be a grenadier or a bombardier, as they later became called, to have anything to do with gunpowder at all, because it was so, the gunpowder itself, people didn't really know the amount or when to light it or what it might do. It was all a bit unexpected. Guns also recoiled, they came back on the people firing the gun because of the power of the explosion. So quite often the early guns did more harm to the people firing them than the people they were firing upon. But that was the idea of using a new invention. It started at Crécy, cannon. So that was the first use of artillery in a European battle. And I Googled it, and there's a lot about how how guns and cannon developed, became more reliable, but never completely reliable until they learned how to have a solid piece of metal and bore a hole through the middle of it, so there wasn't a seam anywhere, so it couldn't explode and cause trouble for the people that were actually firing it. So the war in France went well, and eventually we did make peace with the French, and we gained full sovereignty over Gascony, Poitou, Calais, other lands in northern France, and King John had to pay the equivalent of £3 million in ransom. He was captured, put in the Tower of London, manacled. His people had to pay. So that was totally paying them back, if you like, for all the provocation and the trouble they'd caused. They were paid back 10 times over, you could say. In return, Edward III graciously renounced his right to the French throne. Said, I hereby declare that I am not claiming to be the King of France. Interesting, though, the fleur-de-lis continued to be used on the British coat, the English King's coat of arms, on the royal standard. But he did say he didn't want to be King of France anymore. So we had won hands down. We had done amazingly well. Edward III came out of it as an absolutely one of our best kings. He'd redeemed the nation's honour, and he had fought a good fight. He had, there weren't any scandals, there weren't any disgraceful occasions where his troops had got out of control and done awful things, because that was a problem with medieval armies. His troops hadn't decided to up sticks and go home, which was another problem for medieval armies, that many of the people fighting were, of course, farmers. And when he got near, well, any particular time in the farming year, when they needed to be back on their farms, they started to worry that they were still on campaign and just leg it, just go home. So the king hadn't had any of those problems. He had a loyal army, they'd fought well, they'd delivered the goods, and they came back in triumph. And then we had this very reasonable peace treaty, 1360, signed in Calais, the Treaty of Bretigny, and that seemed very reasonable, considering that the French had been pushing their luck for a long time and doing all sorts of naughty things to our trade. And then trade settled down. We traded with France probably more than any other country. So then we're going to just look and see why his reign is regarded as one of the very successful reigns in our history. It wasn't just that it went on for a long time, but it was a reign of two halves. Towards the end, of course, it was in decline. The king was in decline, and things started to go wrong. But there are many developments that took place during the 14th century. We've already mentioned the royal family, that they gave a wonderful example to the rest of the nation. Lots of children and peace and harmony within the royal family. king and queen were on excellent terms with their children. That certainly wasn't always the case during medieval times, that the royal family were at peace with one another. The development of the cloth industry, mentioned this before, that was the woolen industry was our staple. And very strict rules and regulations applied, the wool staple. It was rules about the width of the cloth, length of a bale of cloth, very strict indeed, so that when people bought English cloth, they were assured that it was of top quality, it had been checked, it was the right length, it was the right width, nobody was cheating or getting money under false pretenses. And we established a reputation which lasted, well, it should last until today, but it's probably being a bit eroded now. An Englishman's word being his honour, that if you shook hands with an English trader, he would keep his promise, whatever it was. It was developed even more in the 19th century, that it was said that you only needed to shake hands with an English businessman and he would keep his promise, whatever it was, to deliver the goods, and they would be good quality. There would be no cheating, no backsliding on the contract, no cheating of any kind. They're a lovely reputation to have, and it did start in the 14th century with our wool, our woolen cloth, second to none, top quality. And if we said we would deliver so many bales, then we did. And that was partly because of the king having this policy of honour, of talking about King Arthur and Christian standards of trade and warfare and everyday life. That he set a high standard for himself, for his family, and for his people. And people rose to the challenge, which people usually do if they're offered something that makes them feel good about themselves. Then it doesn't have to be warfare. It can just be the way they behave in civilian life. And that was something that the king was able to promote. Crown and Parliament working together. As we've already said, the king had he relied on Parliament, but he had great respect for Parliament. He understood this early form of democracy. He didn't see the MPs as challenging him and being a nuisance, which some earlier kings had done. How dare these ordinary people challenge the rights of the king? And of course, that went right through to Charles I. How dare these ordinary people challenge the king? Well, Edward III didn't feel like that. He rejoiced in Parliament. He called them every year, because it was still up to the king to call Parliament, to ask Parliament to assemble in Westminster. And he did so every year. So they honoured him and he honoured them. Wonderful relationship. The tax system became more sophisticated, as we've already said, thanks to the king checking up on cheats, rogues, people, tax collectors who demanded more money and kept the surplus for themselves, which has been happening all over the world. As long as there have been taxes, there have been bad tax collectors. And if you think about the Bible, the tax collectors were sort of counted as really bad people. Jesus was accused of eating with tax collectors and sinners. Because they worked for the Romans, but that wasn't the only reason. It was because they took more money than they needed and they kept the surplus for themselves. Well, the king was very aware of human nature, and he sacked tax collectors that were proved to be rogues, and the tax system became very efficient and very righteous. Cheats were disgraced, publicly disgraced. You could throw things at them. They were put in the stocks, which is brilliant. I think we might bring that idea back today. So people who have offended against the community, we can go and throw old cabbages at, well, perhaps not a whole cabbage, but throw things at them just to show how indignant we are, to express how we feel. So that was, as you know, a way of a local way of controlling certain bad people, that they were publicly disgraced. They were paraded through the streets before, and then they were put in the stocks for a day, 2 days, 3 days, and people could throw things at them or shout at them. I mean, perhaps we wouldn't throw things, but we might go and shout at them or tell them what we think. And it would be a sort of release for some of our frustration with some of the things that are going wrong today. I am only joking, so please don't quote me.
It'll be on the film. It'll be on the film.
Not to find myself in
It'll-
that. But I think a lot of people do feel that our medieval ancestors had some good ideas about local government, local opinion being expressed. The 100 Years' War between France and England, of course, that characterised the reign. And we've got the Black Death, which of course destroyed. I put a third, but the recent research indicates half the population. It is very difficult to know, obviously, after such a long time. But the number has been revised upwards. And so they now think half the population, not just of this country, but of Europe, was destroyed by the Black Death, which is a dreadful, dreadful thought. So we're going to do Black Death next time in a fortnight. Prepare yourself for Black Death. Breakdown of the feudal system. This wasn't to do with the king. This was just an economic development, that the very rigid feudal system was beginning to break down. Sounds rather dramatic, as though it was a revolution or something. It was just because of economic factors, which we'll also do separately. And it broke down even more after the Black Death, which we will explain next week. And this was good in many ways. It gave people opportunities to do something apart from being a farmer, a peasant farmer, a villein. But it didn't break down without problems. We've got the Peasants' Revolt taking place during the king's reign. That wasn't good. It failed, but it wasn't good that the peasants felt so desperate that they marched to London and with weapons and sort of rebelled against the system. Then we've got the development of explosives, which I've already mentioned. Guns and grenades. So grenades are obviously explosives that you could throw. Again, nobody really understood how much gunpowder to use or at what point you threw the grenade. It was all very literally sort of hit and miss, and if you didn't throw your grenade quickly enough, you blew yourself up. But once something's been invented, it doesn't usually, people don't usually abandon it. Even if it doesn't work straight away, people will sort of work on it and improve it. And that's what happened with guns, explosives. They didn't say, oh, they're dangerous, they're more trouble than they're worth. They just said, this is a very potent way of killing people. We will just perfect it so there aren't as many accidents taking place and the gunners being injured by the gun itself exploding. So it changed the design of castles. There were all sorts of consequences. Use of mules, interestingly. Mules are stronger than donkeys, but they're bigger, and they're more sure-footed than horses. So mules for dragging heavy ordnance, dragging heavy guns, and that continued. That mules were used, so lots of mule breeding taking place. Just a little side issue, not particularly important, but just sort of significant, that one change creates lots of other changes. Heraldry. Now, heraldry is a very important study in its own right. Some of you may have studied heraldry at school or later. Why did they need heraldry? Why did they need well, well, shields, sort of coats of arms, shields with pictures on. Well, in the early days of fighting, they didn't. If you look at the Bayeux Tapestry, a shield was just a simple shield. It didn't have a pattern on it. So why did they need coats of arms? Why did these very elaborate standards or pictures representing a family? How did that develop? Well, it developed as armour developed. But instead of chainmail, plate armour was invented, where you were sort of fastened into a suit of armour. Somebody had to help you into it. Obviously, you couldn't do it yourself, because it needed the equivalent of a screwdriver to put all the different parts of your armour together and fasten it together. And then a closed helmet with a visor that lifted up and down. When you closed it, nobody could see who you were. You were anonymous. Well, you didn't want to be anonymous because you wouldn't know who you couldn't see who your enemy was, and they couldn't see who you were. So you might be killing the wrong people. You needed some form of identification because they couldn't see your face anymore. So the idea then was that each family would have some kind of identifying an emblem of some sort. So the very earliest kind of heraldry was very simple, like the Crusaders just had a red cross on a white background because they were fighting for Christ. That was easy. Red cross on a white background. Some countries had a different coloured cross, but the cross was the emblem, fighting for Christ. The very earliest shields, coats of arms, family coats of arms, were very simple. One device on a specific background. Then rules started to appear that you didn't have a metal on a metal because it didn't show when the sun shone. So if you've got a gold background, you didn't put a silver swan on it because when the sun shone, it would just be shining like a mirror and people wouldn't be able to see it properly. So rules began to develop about colours that were appropriate and metals that were appropriate. Never metal on metal. And the devices, the actual illustrations, if you like, became more complex. And then people chose a different emblem to put on their helmets so that people could see at a glance. Oh, yes, he's on our side. I know who he is. He's the Duke of Lancaster. Or he's the Prince of Wales. He's got the 3 feathers. He's the Prince of Wales. So every family developed what's called a coat of arms. And the idea was that this developed during crusading. In a very hot country, plate armour is a nightmare because it gets very hot. And you are sort of boiling, you are cooking inside your plate armour in very intense heat. So they wore a surcoat or circuit. It was linen, usually linen or cotton, that you put on over. It's like a pinafore dress that you put on over your armour, and then you could put your coat of arms on it. The horse also had armour. The horse also would get overheated. So your horse had a circuit as well. And you could put your coat of arms on that too. And then just to be on the safe side, put the family emblem sticking up on the top of your helmet so that people could recognise you. So because in the excitement of battle, people ended up on the wrong side of the battlefield. So it was very important to recognise people, to be able to identify them, friend or foe, without people lifting their visors up and showing their faces. That was the right way to get an arrow in your face. So heraldry really took off and became, well, the College of Heralds opened, where you had to apply for a coat of arms to make sure that it wasn't the same as somebody else's. If it was similar to another family's, then the College of Heralds would advise you and say, well, if you change the background to red, or if you do such and such, you can have that, but it's very similar to another family, so it would be better if you chose a different design altogether, and we will help you. with that. The other thing that could happen was that you could put half your shield for your wife, if you chose to. If you'd married into a noble family, and noblemen tended to marry into other noble families, then one of the marriage agreements was that the wife could have her half, her important coat of arms, on the family crest, the family coat of arms, and then you could quarter them, and in some cases, eighth. So you could divide the shield up into sections, and each person could have. So that's what happened with our fleur-de-lis. That was put onto the royal standard of England as a very provocative way of saying our king is actually the King of France. So heraldry developed and became, well, a very important issue, really, for the sort of arguments that went on. Tournaments was an opportunity to flourish your coat of arms, because tournaments were sort of pretend battles. They were incredibly popular during Edward's reign and continued to be right through, really, as far as the Civil War in the 17th century. Particularly popular in the reign of Henry VIII. He absolutely loved jousting. He loved tournaments. If you've ever read Ivanhoe, a lot of the novel of Ivanhoe, sort of the tournaments figure very largely in that. People practicing their battle skills, but also an opportunity for people to meet, and it's all very exciting. Another development, the English language being spoken by the majority of people. You didn't have to learn Norman French. Posh people could still speak Norman French. They could choose to speak French, but English became the national language, even for the nobility. And this was exemplified by Chaucer, who was the court poet. You could say he was the poet laureate. A lot of people say he was the first poet laureate. He wasn't really, he would just worked for the court. He had a job, sort of writing poetry for the court. And some of us have done the Canterbury Tales at school. Canterbury Tales, absolutely brilliant concept. There'd be a bunch of pilgrims making their way from London to Canterbury, which is quite a trek. And to while away the journey, while away the time as they rode to Canterbury, they would tell each other a story, a tale, and they would tell another one on the way back. Well, Chaucer never got round to writing the ones on the way back, but we have got the ones that the pilgrims told on the way to Canterbury. And they are absolutely precious. They are absolutely amazing, because they are very readable. And some of them are very rude, actually. They're very cheeky, and they're naughty stories. We didn't do the naughty ones for A-level. It was sort of referred to, but we didn't do the naughty ones. But we all scampered off and read them out of class, because we've been told which the naughty ones were. And Martin found a wonderful picture showing the different characters from the Canterbury Tales on the back of your notes. Wonderful. The wife of Bath, the franklin, the miller, the pardoner, the cook, the monk, the friar, the parson, the yeoman, the knight, the prioress, the shipman, the squire, the steward, the physician, the merchant, the summoner. And what is amazing, it's an absolute wonderful insight into 14th century England, into the life of our ancestors. He's covered a huge area, very skillfully choosing people to represent a certain aspect of life. And what's very, very interesting is that although it was a period of great religious fervour, hence people going to Canterbury to pray, going on pilgrimage, it became a huge thing in the 14th century. And new religious houses being built and churches being developed, well, churches being improved, Gothic style. You know, it's a time of great building and a great religious fervour. But interestingly, although Chaucer chose a lot of religious people as his pilgrims, they're nearly all baddies. Very provocative for him to write in that way. The monk and the friar are worldly and like women. The pardoner is a baddie. He actually produces false, fake relics. He's a really unpleasant character. He looks horrible, and he cheats people. He's a rogue and a cheat. The summoner is a baddie. All the religious people, apart from even the prioress, is worldly. She wears jewelry, and she's very vain. She's not bad, but she's not particularly good either. It's fascinating that he got away with it. Probably because he was the court poet and he was protected. But he was pointing out the faults in the church in the introduction, in the what's called the prologue, where the characters are introduced, and we know something of their backstory. They're introduced. It's like the beginning of sometimes you buy a paperback and there's quite a bit about the author. So it's a picture of 14th century life. The wife of Bath is probably one of the most famous. She'd had 5 husbands, and she's very outspoken, and she talks about marriage in a very disparaging way. She's a brilliant character. She's sort of a comedienne, really. And I did the knight and the squire. We did their actual story. We did the prologue, and then we had to do 2 tales. And I say some of the tales are well, a bit crude and a bit naughty. So they are not used for A-level study. I don't know if they do them if you do English at university, perhaps you do the whole lot. But absolutely fascinating. So I recommend further study of the Canterbury Tales, because they are this absolutely wonderful picture of how our ancestors lived in the reign of Edward III. Really wonderful insight. The last thing is, it was a time of extravagance in food, particularly costume, different ways of living. The church getting very agitated about this, particularly about the fine food that people were eating, like having feasts where they served up swan as the main ingredient, or peacock as the main ingredient. Swan feasts and peacock feasts, they were called, with food to match, posh food. The church denouncing this, that the king was setting a very bad example, the noblemen were following suit, as people do, they follow the royal family. People spending ridiculous amounts of money on fancy food, but even more excited, they got even more excited about people wearing fancy clothes, imported cloth, imported fabrics like damask, brocade, silk, velvet, lame, gold and silver cloth, muslin, which comes from the word muslim, very, very fine cotton, so fine you can see through it, muslin, very much in demand for veiling, for veils. So all these foreign fabrics, we could make wool, we could make linen, we couldn't make anything else. So we imported these, and it was an incredible expense, very, very expensive indeed. And it's hard to understand why women and men started to wear fashionable clothes, because before that, clothes had just been really to cover people up. They were to keep warm, and in case of women, just to cover them up, sort of like bundles looking. Not fashionable. Well, there weren't such things as fashions. Women had to cover their hair, of course, and they were sort of wrapped up, rather like Muslim women in some countries. And then in the 14th century, partly because these fabrics became available as trade routes improved, we could get these fabrics from the Middle East and the Far East in exchange for our woolen cloth and leather and timber, all sorts of things that we could trade. Even corn if we'd had a good harvest. We were importing these fantastic new fabrics, and it's the beginning of actual fashion where people were wearing a certain style and then copying each other and taking the style to extremes, which is what happens with fashion. Then everybody gets bored of it and then decides on some other crazy idea. So women particularly were driving this. The royal family, the Queen, like she wasn't particularly good shape because she was pregnant most of the time, but she liked nice clothes, and the king indulged her. He could afford to, and he got all this money flowing in from ransoms, so he could indulge his wife without irritating everybody. The Queen was very popular. That was unusual. Most medieval queens were not, because they were seen as drains on the economy because they were extravagant. Queen Philippa got away with it. So the court began to dress in a very extravagant way, men included. For example, a strange kind of shoe became popular for the men, called a pollane. It came from Poland. It was a leather shoe with a very pointy toe. So once somebody started wearing it, somebody else said, "Oh, I like shoes." They then had even more exaggerated shoes that pointed out even more. And eventually the shoes got so ridiculous, this was mainly the young men at court, all outdoing each other with how pointed and long their shoes were, extended from beyond their foot, that eventually they became a sort of bit of a hazard. And they had to put a little chain on the pointy bit at the end and chain it up to their calf, which looked ridiculous. But they went on doing it, because it became a competition to see whose shoes were the longest and the most ridiculous and used the most leather. And then it died just as suddenly as it had started, as fashions do. People don't sort of get fed up and they think of something else. Young men started to wear very, very short tunics. So they looked a bit like ballet dancers, like the men in Swan Lake. They wore very tight tights. The church started to get very annoyed about this because young men were showing all they'd got. The tights were very tight and the tunic was very short. Strange hats made of different materials. And the women, outrageously, were wearing tight-fitted clothes. And the clergy were going mad, denouncing this from the pulpit, week in, week out. You will be punished for this. What are you doing? Why are you showing your hair? The women are supposed to cover their hair. They're supposed to be modest.
What about makeup, Julie?
No, not makeup.
Not makeup.
No makeup. But very extravagant clothes, which we will do a little bit at the end of the reign. Large amounts of fabric being used, but deliberately to show off. Trains, so that you had to have a page boy trotting along behind you because you couldn't possibly walk unless you had somebody carrying the train. Extravagance in the amount of fabric used in your clothes, not to cover you up to make you modest, which is what the church taught, but trailing on the floor just to show how posh and rich you were. Sometimes 2 page boys needed. And for the men, not just the women, to show how important and how wealthy you were, and how you didn't have to work. It was a statement. I don't have to work. Look at how long my train is. I can't move unless these 2 young men trot along behind me. So you can imagine how angry the clergy were, so saying, you are becoming totally monetaristic, you're becoming totally obsessed with competition, trying to keep up with the Joneses. Well, they didn't say that, obviously, but the competition was seen as very ungodly and un-Christian. But the top people took absolutely no notice. Carried on with these elaborate and in some cases ridiculous fashions, using huge amounts of money, eating extravagant food, and the church saying, God is not mocked, God will get angry. So you can imagine that when the Black Death struck, it was told you so. God is not mocked, God is very angry. You are all becoming so competitive and materialistic, and God has done what he did in the Old Testament. He sent a plague to sort you all out. So we'll leave it there and we'll do the Black Death in detail and its consequences, which are very important, in a fortnight's time. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Judy. Don't forget that the gorier it gets, the bloodier it gets, the more gruesome it gets, the more involved Judy will become and more agitated.
So could I just say, those of you who said you'd come to our church quiz on the 9th of March, there are still 4 or possibly 8 tickets left. If anybody else would like to join us on the 9th of March, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's a Saturday, at Boldmere Methodist Church, which is easy to find. It's on Boldmere High Street opposite the Harvester. So 4 tickets definitely left, probably 8. We can manage 44 places in the room, and the people have already said that they would like to come. You will need to let me know your choices for food. So it's chicken and chips, fish and chips, or vegetarian pasty and chips. And you will need to let me know so that Flo O'Connor from King's Standing can book it in. So yeah, I'll leave that with you. My number is 354 1913. If you can't remember it,
Get hold of me.
get hold of Martin, and Martin will contact me. All right.
Thank you, gentlefolk.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was brilliant.